Rudyard Griffiths here at The Hub. Welcome to Hub Hits, where we bring you the best analysis and insights of our writers and thinkers appearing on the Hub platform today. A real pleasure to welcome on Eric Kaufmann, professor of politics at Buckingham University. He's got a terrific piece for us on the Americanization of Canadian politics. It might be a little bit different than you think. It's not necessarily all about the media or popular culture, is it, Eric? It's about maybe something more fundamental. Why don't you unpack your thesis for our listening and viewing audience?
Yeah, so really what I'm doing here is I'm applying the argument that across the West, we see a realignment of politics from the old economic left-right to a more cultural dimension. Call it globalist, nationalist, or open-closed. And those cultural dimensions are becoming more important. And the old economic left, right, where the union members voted for the left and, the business people voted for the right. I mean, that it's not gone away entirely, but it's become overshadowed by this other dimension. And what we see is that in country after country around the West, for example, university educated people are more likely to be voting for a left-wing party like the Democrats. And so education becomes a very important cleavage, and that's linked to cultural issues, in particular immigration. And so as politics comes to revolve around these more cultural issues, the education polarization becomes more important. And what I've argued in this piece here is that, in fact, if you look at the recent election, university graduates compared to non-graduates, there's a significant 20-point gap in their voting patterns. Whereas if you compare that, for example, to people earning 100,000 or more, they voted 50-50 between the Liberals and the Conservatives. The economic income dimension matters a lot less. Instead, it's the highly educated that are going more for the Liberal Party, and it's the high school or less that are going more for the Conservatives. Issues like immigration, issues around questions on the culture wars, which didn't feature in the election, by the way. But if you look at the data on opinions, that really helps to separate out the electorate. There are big gaps on questions such as, for example, support for Black Lives Matter, questions around the trans issue, questions around immigration, which, again, not entering into the electoral debates, but actually making a big difference in terms of which party you support.
Let's go to a graph here from your article appearing on the Hub today that looks at that issue of immigration. What we're seeing here is immigration opinion by vote, 2015 to 2019. This is for Canada out of ECOS. And it's showing attitudes here. Agree that those immigrating to Canada, there are too many members of visible minorities. So, wow, look at the difference here between conservative identified voters and Liberals. 69% saying there are too many visible minorities immigrating to Canada versus only 15% of Liberals. What's behind this, Eric?
Well, but the first thing to say is that as many non-whites agreed with that statement as whites, it's partly an index of immigration attitudes as well. It's worth saying that what happened there is you had people to some degree switching parties based on their immigration opinion, because this was not an issue pushed by the Conservatives. So you couldn't make the argument, oh, well, Conservative voters suddenly became more opposed to immigration because, Erin O'Toole or Andrew Scheer were pushing this message. In fact, it seems to be more that those people who voted Conservative gravitated to those opinions or switched for that reason. It's interesting to note that in the US, we have almost exactly the same graph as that. That up until 2012, when you had Romney and Obama, there wasn't that much difference between Republicans and Democrats in their immigration opinion. By 2016, with Trump, the difference had gone from 12 points to 50 points. Here we see a difference going from 2015 of about, 15 points to what looks like over 50 points. It's the same time period. And that is, again, in line with his realignment hypothesis. And so as culture comes to underpin vote, you get these much more durable splits. And what that means is people actually are attached more strongly to party labels, which are indicative of some of these cultural attitudes. And what that then leads to is what's called effective polarization by political scientists. So Republicans start to feel really warm towards Republicans and really cold towards the
Right.
Democrats, and any Democratic leader gets a really low rating. And we're starting to see that in Canada as well.
Yeah, your article has some great stats on just the extent to which, conservatives are unable or unwilling to give Mark Carney the benefit of the doubt and vice versa. What do you think this means for Canada, Eric? You are a Canadian. You're teaching in the UK, but you've got deep knowledge and roots here in Canada in our political culture. We are, a country historically that has a long history of viable third parties. We haven't seen this type of polarization. So if this is now a feature and not a bug of Canada's political culture, what do you think that means going forward? Are we more likely, for instance, not to see the NDP reemerge as a viable third-party force over the next period of time? Is the People's Party, similarly, to the right of the political spectrum in Canada, increasingly a dead proposition?
Well, I think the first thing to say is I think that if you take the pre-2000 model where you had voters in the center who would swing between the conservatives and the liberals based on whether they liked the leader, or whether the economy was doing well, I think that kind of politics is going to decline. So you're going to have two blocks, the left block, which will be the Liberal Party plus Greens and NDP, and then the right block will be Tory and PPC. So instead of swinging between Liberals and Tories, we are going to see movement between the flank parties like NDP and Liberal, or between PPC and Tories, based on the dissatisfaction of the flanks with the way their mainstream party is doing. So I do expect to see a certain movement between, say, NDP and Liberal one cycle over the next, and between PPC and Tories. Now, right now, of course, the two main parties are pushing 90% of the total. I think that speaks to a certain degree of satisfaction with the mainstream within bloc. So left NDP happy to lend their votes to the Liberal Party, and likewise with the PPC. But it's not inconceivable that if Carney gets in and really moves to the center, he could annoy the NDP and the Greens, and their vote could swell next election. So I'm not saying that couldn't happen, but notice that's movement between the Liberals and the NDP, or
Right.
between Conservative and PPC. That's where I see the movement, not so much between Liberal and Conservative as in the past. So in this new system, the movement is between the flanks and the moderates within bloc, rather than between the two main centrist parties.
Mm-hmm. And just to reiterate, to end on this, because I think it's really important for the audience to understand that the fundamental thesis here is that values, not necessarily economic interest, of course, will always factor in other proclivities and desires on the part of the electorate. But what you're really saying here, Eric, is that values are going to shape political preferences. And if that is the case, then what do you expect from the parties? Because right now, we've got a lot of talk about a trade fight with the Americans. We have an economy in the doldrums. Our discussions don't seem value filled right now. And frankly, maybe in Mark Carney, you have a leader who seems kind of, I don't know, reluctant, uncomfortable with a heavy kind of values proposition like his predecessor, Justin Trudeau, who was in a sense a high values proposition candidate. So a lot in there, but I just want to get your sense of texture about how a values-based politics in Canada looks vis-a-vis, Mark Carney and the government that he's now assembling.
Well, I think the economic issues are competency based. I don't think, you don't have enormous gaps necessarily in policy terms between the parties. So yes, there is a managerial competence aspect, which will have some impact on the vote. But in terms of positional issues that really separate people in identity terms as to which party they're going to choose, I think these values dimensions are going to be more important. So it's not to say that performance and competence on the economy doesn't matter, but those are largely going to be what are called valence or competency issues. Whereas which party you decide to go for is going to be more and more determined, I think, by these values dimensions, even if they're not openly debated. And we didn't see them openly debated, but it doesn't mean that they're not actually structuring electoral competition.
Final question. You mentioned immigration. We showed that chart, that wide, yawning split. And as you said, that's not white versus non-white voters. That's simply the entire population represented in terms of political preference, liberal versus conservatives. Do you see immigration, because it has been such a big feature in European and American politics, do you see this as one of the big value debates that maybe is still unresolved in Canada and may have a disproportionate impact on our politics going forward?
Yeah, I think it's just sort of one of those cultural issues, positional issues that is structuring the electorate. So your view on that question is actually going to be a lot more important than your views on management of the economy in terms of who you're going to vote for. So I think it's a symbol, like the cultural war issues around, statue toppling, around trans, around freedom of speech, around some of these other things. I think they're operating to actually not determine, but to structure partisanship in the background. And it's clear that if a party is seen as weak on those issues to its base in a way, that base could defect. We're seeing that a bit in Britain right now, where the Conservative Party base, they voted for UKIP, then they went over to Boris Johnson's Tories when they thought the Tories were robust. Then when the Tories ramped up immigration, they've defected en masse back to reform. So I see that kind of dynamic moving between the flanks and the middle, but not crossing over necessarily blocks. I think those days really belong to an earlier time. So I just think this is a new era. And I think also the fact that Conservatives gained, the highest share of the popular vote in 40 years in Canada is indicative of the fact that this kind of somewhat more robust politics is actually quite successful and will not damage the Conservatives. And I think that also at the same time might slightly spook voters on the left into maybe saying, well, if we vote for the NDP, we might give the Tories a chance, so we're going to go with Liberals. And so that's another dimension of this. In the US, third parties don't do very well because no one wants to give the other side, the advantage because they really worry about that. And so that is another possibility. We could see Canada moving to a very strongly two-party system because flank voters are just very concerned about giving the other party, who they don't identify with in values terms, giving them office. And so that's another one to watch, whether Canada in fact does go down that route or whether it's more like Britain and the flank parties kind of discipline the parties in the middle not to stray too far from the base.
Great insights, Eric. Thank you so much for coming on the program, and urge all of our listeners to both check out your article and check out that red book that's just over your shoulder there. It's called The Third Awakening. No. We can see it now. Eric's latest bestseller. Check it out, The Third Awakening, and head over to the Hub and read his article, www.thehub.ca. Thanks, Eric, for coming on the program.
Thanks, Roger. It's been a pleasure.
That's it, everybody, for this edition of Hub Hits. We hope you enjoyed the program. Please share with friends and family, subscribe wherever you get to your audio and video, and look for more Hub Hits in our podcast feed or on our YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm Rudyard Griffiths.